Good evening and welcome to Current Issues. I'm your host, Hesham Tillawi. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we will be discussing the USS Liberty ship that was attacked back in 1967 by the Israeli Air Force. We had, as you have been following the show, we have talked about the USS Liberty on many occasions, and tonight we will be speaking with the gentleman who actually conducted the investigation of what had happened on that day in 1967. Let me just give you a little bit of background, and then we will dive deep into it. The USS Liberty incident was an attack on a United States Navy intelligence ship. And as I have mentioned, the name of that ship was USS Liberty. In the waters about 12.5 nautical miles from the coast of the Sinai Peninsula, this happened during the Arab-Israeli War of 1967. American ship was in international water, and Israel sent its torpedo boats and its air force to actually sink that ship. But after the investigation was over, and I'm putting over in quotation marks, the people who were conducting the investigation were told to say that it was a mistaken identity, that the Israelis did not know that it was an American ship. And that's how the story, and that's where the story ended as far as the United States government was concerned. But the truth, ladies and gentlemen, was completely opposite of the official story of mistaken identity. The story that people who worked on it and people who were on the ship, the story of the investigator who conducted the investigation was, and his feelings, that it was a deliberate act of murder. With me tonight, ladies and gentlemen, I have Captain Ward Boston. He was the senior counsel to the United States Navy Court of Inquiries investigating the Israeli attack on the USS Liberty. He was told at the time not to say anything about this incident, and he followed orders very well until recently when he had enough and he wanted to come out and tell the world that he did not believe the story of mistaken identity. Also with us tonight, we will have Mark Glenn, American Free Press reporter, who's working on a series of stories about the USS Liberty. And in the second hour, we will have one of the people who were actually on the ship. And he's one of our own, a Louisianan. And we will introduce him in the second hour. And we were going to have Mark Glenn with us for the 2 hours so we can get to the bottom of this. And why is it so important now that we bring up the USS Liberty? As I understand it, other people have taken the initiative actually to bring this subject back up. So for the least of what we can do is to get the record straight. But I really want, what we want to try to get out of this is, if Israel did it deliberately, we need to ask why. And we need to find out if this relationship with Israel is really good for the United States or not. So, without any further ado, let's go to Captain Ward Boston. Welcome to the show, sir.
Yes. This is Captain Ward Boston, retired United States Navy. 5 years ago, in 2002, I was contacted by the Navy Times, the Marine and Navy Times, by phone, inquiring if I had an opinion as to whether it was an accidental attack or not. And up until that telephone call, I had followed the orders from President Johnson and Secretary of Defense McNamara issued to Admiral Kidd, who was president of the Court of Inquiry, which I was the senior counsel. He advised that they said, don't talk to anybody about the matter once we had finished the time frame they allowed us to look at the matter. So I'll give you a brief summary of how I got involved.
Okay.
Back in 1967, I was a senior lawyer in Italy for the Navy as a commander of Fleet Air, which was Admiral Riera. The NATO command in Naples, where we were stationed, was the aft south, and that was Admiral Rivero. Well, Admiral Kidd worked for Admiral Rivero. I worked for Admiral Riera. And I had a call in the middle of the night, right after the Liberty was attacked, and by Admiral Kidd, and asking if I knew anything. And I said yes. I had listened to it in the operations center that day when we were getting piecemeal information. But because these radios had shot the antennas off of the ship, it took a while to get the SOS out from the ship, and in order to try to get some Navy planes down to protect it. So anyway, I said yes. So Admiral Kidd said that Admiral McCain, who was a senior admiral in the Navy in European waters, and he was our immediate boss in London, had appointed him to be the president of a court of inquiry, and that Admiral Kidd wanted me to go along to be the counsel. And I tried to explain that I probably would have to investigate to review the record. So I tried to suggest maybe I shouldn't, but he insisted and said Admiral McCain had already appointed both of us.
Now, where were you at the time?
I was in Naples. I was a senior lawyer there on the staff.
Do you have any idea why they picked you?
Why what?
Why did they pick you in particular? Do you have any idea?
Yes, because Admiral Kidd knew me from professional experience. As I explained, he was over at a NATO staff. He was a senior U.S. national on the Admiral Rivero staff, which was Allied Forces Southern Europe. And I was on the senior U.S. national staff. So because it involved a U.S. ship, I would eventually review it. But he knew me, and so Admiral McCain was this convening authority. In other words, the one who set up the court of inquiry, said for me to come along as the counsel for the court. So Admiral Kidd, this was in the middle of the night, and he called and said, get your bags packed, we're leaving in 20 minutes for London. So we flew up to London, got there early in the morning, and Admiral McCain was waiting for us in his office. First thing he wanted, well, what kind of an investigation? In other words, in the Navy we have three levels, a simple investigation, a board of investigation, and a court of inquiry. The court of inquiry is where you have the authority to take witnesses under oath and treat it just like a grand jury is treated in civilian life. So it takes the place of a grand jury, and you have an Article 32 investigation through the court. So anyway, we arrived in London, and Admiral McCain had said, what kind of how should we go about this? I said, well, I think a court of inquiry. Well, he decided better call General Lemnisser, who was the overall European commander, to get his opinion as to which way to go. Well, General Lemnisser was out of town, wasn't available, but his four-star deputy Air Force was the officer who was there. But he wanted to check with his Judge Advocate General, which he did, and he called back and told us to go ahead and take it. So we left, Admiral Kidd and I, flew down to Crete, boarded a destroyer, and rendezvoused with Liberty in Egyptian waters on its way trying to get out of that area. It was in terrible shape, big hole in the side, and amidships where a torpedo had gone in, killing 25, we had 25 bodies still in there. when we boarded. And Admiral Kidd and I climbed over that hole up to board the Liberty, and went up to the Captain McGonigal, who was the Commander McGonigal was the skipper of the Liberty, and he was in his cabin, and with his leg propped up, he had a hole in his leg, and he just lost a lot of blood. And I shook hands with him, and he winced, and next day he told me he had shrapnel in his hand and didn't know it until I shook his hand. Well, while I was talking with him, I mean, we were chatting before we went and found some place to sleep. A young naval officer, I think he was a lieutenant junior grade, the name of Scott, came running in, and he was called a damage control assistant. Now, a damage control assistant takes over when the ship's been damaged like Liberty had, and try to save it. And he said, Captain, he said, I don't think we're going to make it. I think the ship's going to break in two from that torpedo hole in the midships. Well, that got my attention because in World War II I was a fighter pilot on 7 carriers, and one of them on Yorktown, the one I was on in combat, I had a cabin or stateroom in what they call Torpedo Junction, and I thought if the Japanese put a torpedo midships on Yorktown, it would get me. Well, here I got into that many years earlier, and then I said he got my attention when he said he thought the ship would break in two. But he was able to shore it up with timbers, and he was able to put mattresses against the bulkhead between the secure part and the flooded part where the 25 bodies were still there. Well, we rode the Liberty back to Malta, and it took about 3 days, I think. That was 40 years ago, so hard to remember how just exactly how long. I think we were 2 days there.
Now, if you don't mind me, let me jump in here and just ask you a couple of questions. Now, when you were given the assignment, you were given 1 week to wrap it up with, right?
That's right. Because when we left London to go down to Liberty, I asked Admiral McCain, I said, what time frame do you expect us to finish the Court of Inquiry? Because the other 2 captains on the Court of Inquiry were going to fly down directly to Malta. And he said, 1 week. I want you back here in 1 week.
Now, did he also tell you which angles or what to investigate? Because there's so many.
The appointing order said, look into all facts pertinent to the attack. It didn't say the Israeli attack. It said the attack on USS Liberty and the injuries and deaths that resulted therefrom, damage, injury, and death. It was a blanket convening authority order, which you have to have. In other words,
who directed the inquiry into mainly find out what communications took place, because that's basically what the inquiry, the majority of the investigation was concentrated on communications, correct?
I didn't have say the question again.
Okay, the bulk of the inquiry was concentrated on communications. Okay, now tell me. Let me ask you that question.
Now I understand what you're saying. That was a part of it. Is that the Joint Chiefs of Staff had alerted Liberty, we discovered through the message traffic, but the message traffic didn't go directly to Liberty. It went around the world. It was missent, and accordingly, even though they were in extraterritorial waters, they were not in territorial waters. They were outside in a proper place to be without being attacked or assaulted.
And so was most of the inquiry on that particular subject of what happened in this communications? Is that where the bulk of...
that was part of why... that was just part that came out, of course. The number one question is that the Joint Chiefs of Staff had said move out further. They gave different 2 or 3 messages suggesting move further out, but the pertinent one that was not received was discovered that it had gone around the world instead of going directly to the Liberty in a direct fashion. So that was part of it. The main incident, as it developed, was the fact that the Israelis knew from our flag, they shot one flag down and they put another one up, and that was shot down. They shot the antennas down first, so there wasn't any way to communicate outside
now,
the.
Captain Boston, at what time during the investigation did you come up with the conclusion that it was deliberate? At what point?
Well, you don't form it. I was very objective in my mind. Even though I had heard it, parts of it that we received on my command there in Naples, I had to listen to these witnesses that were still aboard. Now, you have to realize there were 65 very seriously injured members of the crew that had been taken off the ship immediately as soon as the Sixth Fleet was able to get helos down there and a couple of destroyers. So they were in hospitals around the Mediterranean and in Naples and Germany and other places, but we were down on the ship, so we stayed aboard the ship until we got to Malta, and then we convened the formal court of inquiry, and when the other two captains came from London and were waiting for us. And we were there about 2 days, and during the testimony that we took, there wasn't any problem in my mind, because every evening, or many breaks, while Admiral Kidd and I would discuss the procedures and who we called, and he was getting a little disturbed, and so was I, hearing these witnesses describe a very unprovoked attack. There wasn't any basis for that, and even though it's an unprovoked attack, the Israelis had surveilled the ship from 8 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, flying it back and forth and even waving at the sailors. And the sailors on that type of a mission, all they were doing is going back and forth for, I think, about 15 miles and then reverse the course, 15 nautical miles. And they were sunbathing. When they're on, they give them breaks in between, so the top side of the ship had a lot of sailors sunbathing. And when the first jet came sailing in, that's when we ended up having heads and legs and bodies all over the place. And then they napalmed, and then the last thing, they torpedo boats. So,
Captain Boston,
we were forming an opinion as we go along in our minds.
Okay.
But we had to.
Now, how long? How long did that take? A week?
We were going from where Admiral Kidd and I boarded until we got to Malta. I think with about 2 days.
Okay.
And then we had 2 days there, or 3 days. And time we flew back to London and put the record together, it was 8 days, I think.
Okay. Now, when did the order come to conclude that it was a mistaken identity, and who gave that order?
Well, the record as we had it, it was prepared, and I only had a chief, the Admiral McCain gave me his chief writer, who used a stenomass. And stenomass, they talk into it, and then they type with the record from that. And when we got back to London, we didn't have a record yet prepared, because all he had done was talk. So he started in the first night we got back, and they had about 20 typists, and he'd finish one page and give it to somebody to be typed in the smooth, and 20 of them during the night put together 640 or 660 pages, and that included not only testimony but evidence that I put into log books and anything that would support what had happened to Liberty when it was attacked. Of course, an awful lot of it was destroyed, naturally, from the fire and from the heavy attack. But the 34 killed and 171 or 72 seriously injured, and it was a terrible mess. So you asked the question, when did I form my opinion? I formed it listening to the surviving witnesses describe what happened, and Commander McGonigal, the captain of the ship, had a very good system. He put together a lot of information, so it was very simple to let him relate when he first saw the attacking aircraft and the procedure they followed, and shooting the antennas off, shooting the flag down, shooting up the life raft.
Okay.
All of these incidents brought a clear picture to Admiral Kidd and to me, and I believe to the court the same. Now, you have to realize I was like a district attorney. I wasn't a witness. I mean, I wasn't one who would say if the person's guilty or not guilty. A district attorney puts the case on, and if you have a grand jury, they bring it back a true bill, or if you have a trial, it's the jury who listens to it. It's not the district attorney. And all I was doing was presenting the evidence for them to decide what. And so when we got back and put the record together, then they decided what to say, which they did, in the record, and to support it by the evidence that was available. But you have to have the probative evidence under the proceedings and findings of fact. You can put in anything that is relevant there. The opinions and recommendations flow from that by the members of the court, and when they sat down together and decided what was their opinion and recommendation, then that record was taken back to Washington, and Admiral Kidd carried it back personally, and I went back to Naples because I'd been up a week without much sleep doing most of the legal work that had to be done. And so when he got back from Washington, about 15 days later, 10 or 15 days, I don't remember. I was still tired, but I was doing my normal job. And he called me, and I distinctly remember in his deep voice saying, "Ward," he said, "they aren't interested in the facts. It's a political matter, and we've been told to not talk to anybody. If anybody who knows anything about the case talks, they're in trouble." So that's the reason I kept my mouth shut for 35 years.
Okay.
And then when Crystal wrote his book, and he called me a couple of times trying to...
You're talking about Aaron Crystal?
Yes, Jay Crystal, who wrote his
Aaron
version
J. Crystal, Aaron Crystal.
that claims that it was an accident.
Right. Now let me...
That came out,
okay,
that
go ahead.
book, that's when the Navy Times had called me because his book, he was getting a lot of publicity. Well, the Navy Times asked me that question: did I have an opinion? I said yes, I've had one for 35 years, but I've obeyed the lawful order of the President and the Secretary of Defense. But I said it's been taken over by events now. He's written a book and he's trying to exonerate the murderous, and as Admiral Kidd referred to them, murderous bastards, which I agree was the right way to describe them. Anyway, before we left Malta to come back to London, I told Admiral Kidd, I said we should go to Israel and give the evidence from those people as to why or what they did. And so he said, I'll call Admiral McCain, which he did. McCain said, no, you can't go. Come back.
Now, let me stop you here. Let me ask you something. Were you there when he called Admiral McCain, or he told you I called Admiral McCain and he said no?
I was in doing my legal work, getting witnesses and what have you, and he had to go up in communications and do it. No, I wasn't with him, but when he came back, he distinctly, very positive, said, we can't go to Israel. And he called him Jack McCain. They knew each other that well. And I said, Jack said, come on with what we got. And that's it. So that was just an ex parte, one-sided. What I had was just the witnesses that were still aboard the ship.
Now, let me ask you something. Did you know, or did you have any idea why would the government deliberately, our own government, would deliberately say it's a mistaken identity case and close it and let's move on and don't say anything about it to anyone?
It was very obvious when Admiral Kidd, as I say, called me when he got back from Washington, back to Naples, and that was a week, 10 days, maybe even 2 weeks, and I didn't anticipate the call, but when I talked to him, he starts off in a deep voice saying, Ward, they aren't interested in the facts. It's a political matter, and we're
now,
keep our mouths shut.
Now, sir, you as a soldier that have taken an oath to defend the country, did you...
Hey, wait a minute, I didn't hear you. Say it.
Okay. You as a soldier that took an oath, even though you were not a combat soldier, but you were in the Navy, and you were to defend the country against foreign and domestic enemies. You did not think that by following the order to keep silent that you were actually doing something wrong?
No, I didn't have any reason to think I was doing anything wrong, because it was an order from the letter. It's different. An order you has discretion with it. A command, you have no discretion. This amounted to a command that we keep our mouths shut. Now, normally, and many years ago, half a century ago, I was an FBI agent, and that was between being a fighter pilot in 7 carriers and losing a third of my fighter squadron in combat on the Yorktown, and then coming back in the regular Navy as a JAG or a lawyer type. I know and understand what you're suggesting is that when you, if I saw somebody, some officer draw a gun and shoot somebody, of course I was told to keep my mouth shut. Of course that I wouldn't obey that from anybody. But what we knew is that this was an international matter, international law matter. It had very significant consequences, and I didn't know, Admiral Kidd didn't know.
But 34 Americans died, though.
Behind the scenes, and we didn't know that LBJ and McNamara were very upset that they needed, I've heard from other sources that LBJ indicated he didn't really care. He didn't want to lose his political clout with the Jewish people and all that. Now, that was told later, and I'm sure you can find that from other.
Now, were you afraid at any time while you were still on duty? Did you ever think, I need to say something, I need to talk to somebody, I need to tell my story?
Well, no, because, as I say, this...
It did not even cross your mind? Did not even think about it?
What's that?
You did not even think about it, about telling...
Well, naturally, you're going to... If you look at the political scene that our country has been involved in all the years, as an FBI agent, I saw many things that I questioned people in high office doing, and especially in the congressional hierarchy. But as Thomas Jefferson said, he loves his country, but he didn't like some of the leaders. Well, I didn't have the status after I was given that order to suddenly run up and down the street and say I disagree. But when Crystal wrote his book and came out, well, what happened then is when the Navy Times called me, and I said, yes, I had an opinion. I had had one for 35 years, but I said I was operating under the still, until the order had been rescinded, I was still under that cloak. Now, when Crystal called me, and I said, I can't talk to you about that. Then he starts asking me about my personal background, and I told him I'd been a fighter pilot, and I've been an FBI agent and a law and all that. And so he tried to say later that he interviewed me. He didn't. I wouldn't talk. I said, I can't talk to you about liberty.
Okay.
Anyway, I called Admiral Kidd. I told him to call Admiral Kidd. He was president of the court. And so Kidd calls me back, and I distinctly remember, it was very clear. He said, Ward, he said, that guy you sent me on, he said, I think he's an Israeli agent. Well, I had almost the same reaction, but I wouldn't talk to him. And Admiral Kidd didn't either, although Crystal claimed that he had talked with Admiral Kidd repeatedly.
Okay.
And the Kidd
now,
acted like he believed.
Captain Boston, what would have happened to you and your career if, when you got back and you found out that, or they just want to cover this investigation, and you were the lead investigator in there, what would happen? What would have happened to you if you would have came back and actually talked?
Well, I can't answer your hypothetical question because there wasn't any basis that I would. I didn't even see the court of inquiry until after I had come out and when Crystal wrote his book. And Jim Ennis, who had written a book many years before, and many of his shipmates thought that it was a terrible court of inquiry we ran. But now they thank me, and I've had practically everybody that still survived from the Liberty attack has written me and said, Captain, you were brave to come out. And I said, I wasn't brave. I just kept putting the truth together as it should be, and there wouldn't have been any reason for me to even stay anymore if Crystal hadn't been so painted a picture that was diametrically opposite of what I knew as far as my experience. But back again, there's no way that I had at the time any avenue, or even I was completely removed after that incident from any further involvement. Now, when I got the copy of the Court of Inquiry that Jim Ennis sent me, that he'd gotten through the Freedom of Information Act. That's the first time I looked at that record since it.
And there was some. It wasn't complete, right? Because some stuff that you know was supposed to be in there, it was not in there, right?
Well, that's what I said. The record that I saw that was sent to me had pages missing and blacked out like they black out under Freedom of Information. See,
Now,
it's still a national security matter, definitely way up there. But when the president takes such a personal... Now, there again, an awful lot of things came to light after that. Now, I have a list of names like Dean Rusk, who was the Secretary of State, the number 2 guy in the national security, Toledano, I think is his name. Bobby Inman, who was later deputy NSA. The one that really came out is Richard Helms. Now, the Navy Times, when they wrote that I had indicated a strong language, I had a strong opinion. It was a direct attack, a deliberate attack from being personally involved in the Court of Inquiry. And they said, two skeptics, that's the way the headline said. Captain Ward Boston, retired Coronado, California, Chief Counsel of the Court.
Okay.
And Richard Helms. Now, you know who Richard Helms was, don't you?
Right.
He was the head of the CIA.
Correct.
But then he came out the same time I did and said it was a deliberate attack. And that they had changed. He was under the same admonition that we were. Everybody was involved from the president down.
Let me ask you a question. Do you know who? Have you heard of Anthony Pearson?
Who?
Anthony Pearson.
Anthony Pearson?
Yes, he wrote a book. He wrote a book about the attack on the USS Liberty, and he mentioned in his
Tell his name. I didn't get it.
Anthony Pearson.
Anthony Pearson.
Yes.
No, I've the only books, and Operation Cyanide. I don't have a copy of that, but I saw it, and I've read James Banford's book.
Right.
And, what's that?
Okay. Now, in his book, Anthony Pearson, in his book, he mentioned that Admiral Kidd was Jewish. Did you know that Admiral Kidd was Jewish?
Now you're bringing up something Admiral Kidd laughed out. He said that when when he was back in Washington, now part of the Court of Inquiry recommendations by the court. Now the people, the 2 captains and Admiral Kidd were the court. They were the court. I was the counsel, chief counsel. Now I had an assistant later on a short period of time in London, but he wasn't. He was my assistant to go through some of the communications expertise that I lacked. But that was just to fill in how the ship didn't get the messages. But Admiral Kidd was in Washington. Part of the recommendation was to give the Medal of Honor to McGonigal. And,
right, the captain. But no.
He said that the Jewish delegation or whoever was playing footsie back there, I think in ABBA or one of the was in the White House quite a bit.
Abba.
And anyway, he said that they accused him of being anti-Semitic. And Kidd said, yeah, he laughed. He said, well, the name Isaac? But Kidd was Catholic, and Angelique, his wife, and they had a whole bunch of kids, 8 or 9 kids.
So you know for a fact that he was Catholic because Anthony Pearson said he was Jewish.
Of course I know for a fact. Of course I know I've been in church. I've seen it. I know him quite well.
Okay.
He wasn't Jewish.
Okay. No, that's what Anthony Pearson mentioned in his book. That's why I wanted to ask you about it.
He was called anti-Semitic, and because they wanted to get when they found out McGonigal was McGonigal didn't get his Medal of Honor like all the rest of the Medal of Honor.
Right. The president didn't give it to him.
Him in secret in the gun factory.
Right.
And
okay.
By the Secretary of the Navy, not by the President of the United States, who was Johnson.
Okay.
So it was just a kick in the face. I didn't really think about.
Captain Boston, stay with me. We're going to go to the phones, and we have a lot of people holding. Hold on, please.
Well, listen, before you go...
Sorry, an outside line is not a... Dial. Sorry, an out...
Okay. Let's try this one more time.
Dial. Sorry, an outside...
I don't have anyone online. Okay. So what do you think? What do you think will happen now? Like, I mean, it's been 40 years on this problem. Do you think we will ever get down to the truth? And even if we do, so what? What difference is it going to make after 40 years?
Well, I don't think it's. I think 99% of the Congress people have been wine to dine. They go to Israel and on these junkets, and it's just like McCain said today in the paper. Oh, everything's great over in Iraq, and yet the poor people that he allegedly associated with there, and I'm not knocking him, but they had the place so wired up that he walked around and nobody could bother him. And after he left, well, these merchants said, it's not easy here. It's terrible. Anyway, that's a different story. But what I'm trying to answer your question, I'm not running up and down the street saying I want to talk about liberty. But anybody that wants to ask me, I'll be truthful and tell them exactly how I felt then and now. I don't think you're going to get any Congress people to open it up. Now, there's one gentleman, and I'm not a Democrat, but I have to admire him, John Conyers, C-O-N-Y-E-R, I think he's Michigan. He put my statement, my affidavit I gave Admiral Moore, and also it was read by James Banford in front of that fake State Department. I don't know if you knew back a couple of years ago they had, or maybe they had a State Department closure, they called it, and they had Crystal on the board and a few others. Well, I made it. I couldn't go back because I can't fly with my knees, and so I sent my declaration and my affidavit. And Banford read it, and it really caused a stir of it. But anyway, you've probably seen it because
hold on a second. Captain Boston, hold on a second for me. We have Jim Morris on the phone. Go ahead, Jim.
Hi, Captain Boston. How are you doing? Sorry I haven't spoken to you in a long time, sir. My good friend, Captain.
Now, who am I speaking with?
Sir?
Who is this?
James Morris.
Yes, I'm still here.
James, I know Jim.
Captain Boston, some questions.
Yes, he has some questions for you.
Okay, Jim, go ahead.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, go ahead, James.
Okay, Captain, I haven't spoken to you in quite some time. It's very nice to hear you on the air and sharp and all there as usual. Captain, I wanted to ask you about what you had told me about John McCain's father and how he had basically sold himself out to Israel to help with the cover-up on the Liberty. And basically
what I told you, time is distorted just a little bit.
Okay, Jim, hold on a second. Yeah, go ahead.
Jim, to answer that statement you just made, I didn't say that when I talked with you down here, when I spoke to that intelligence group, when you made a video of it. That's right. Can you hear me?
But I mean, what he had said is that you talked about John McCain's,
I know what he said. I was going to qualify what what I said to him was that I developed the opinion years later after I read everything I read and saw what I saw that Admiral McCain was orchestrating the LBJ's position while we were down in Malta. And when Kid called Admiral McCain and said we want to go to Israel, that Admiral McCain said no, come home with what you've got. So, but as far as selling himself out to the to the Israelis, I didn't have that feeling. I felt that Admiral McCain was doing probably based on talking to President Johnson every day.
That's fine. It's very clear, Captain. Go ahead, Jim.
Hi, Captain. I just wanted to ask you as well a couple other questions here. Lloyd Painter, in the official Naval Court of Inquiry, he's a naval officer, a very damaging witness to the Israeli
they shot up their life vests.
Testimony with the Court of Inquiry about him being an eyewitness to the Israeli torpedo boat machine gunning of the life rafts. That was taken out of the Court of Inquiry. That's a point I wanted to make as well, and I remember you would mention that it had been altered to that effect.
Okay,
and then we were talking about...
okay, Jim.
I'll take one at a time. Go ahead.
Yeah, hold on. Go ahead, Captain.
what you Painter testified that he saw them shoot up the life rafts that were put over the side. Actually, they were shot up yesterday, and there was a story. I don't have it, can't verify it, but I heard it from reliable sources that the Israelis had that one of the life rafts they shot up, and they had it on display in Tel Aviv or someplace in Israel for a long time in one of their museums. But the court of inquiry I received, it was excised in so many ways, blacked out, and didn't have my initials on any of them, so it looked like somebody just put together another one and made it look almost identical. Whether that's what happened, I don't know, but that's the only thing, and I didn't see that copy until Jim Ennis sent it to me well after I had come out and indicated my feelings.
Very good. Very clear. Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Another question I had was when I had faxed Captain Boston's declaration, the lawyer for the Liberty veterans had actually sent it to me. I sent it down to Captain Boston, and I was able to get a copy to James Bamford in time for Jim to read before the State Department panel discussion on the USS Liberty attack cover-up that happened back in January of 2004. Anyway, it had been sent to him, and the historian at the State Department was refusing to add that declaration to the historical record. He's an apparent Jewish American, and he was very biased based on the panel discussion that aired on C-SPAN. He was very biased against the Liberty survivors and even cut one off in the Q&A that followed the discussion. And I had repeatedly been on the phone with him trying to get Captain Boston's declaration added to the historical record. And Mr. Susser even hung up the phone on me, saying that, he's retired and a retired military officer cannot testify as a witness. And Captain Boston actually come back and said, well, that's not correct. Even a retired military officer can, provide testimony as a witness, and there's no reason the declaration couldn't be added to the historical record. And I just wanted Captain Boston to comment on that.
Well, I don't understand why the State Department allowed Crystal and all the rest of those people on that so-called board to put their positions in, and when Bamford tried to read mine, they cut it off without the last paragraph, right? You there, Jim?
Did Bamford was Bamford able to read Captain Boston's declaration, the whole thing, or did they cut it off?
Yeah, he was. Well, what ended up happening is Ron Gotcha had been excellent in getting the declaration to Captain Boston to have signed, and I was able to fax it to Jim. I called him the night before, and the Israel Firsters at the State Department were refusing to admit it to the record. So what I did is I called Jim Bamford the night before, and Jim said he would read it. So what I did is I faxed it to him right away, and he read it the next day. And, of course, Crystal and the other people there, the Israeli apologists in the audience, were very taken back by that. Right. And one could tell that a copy was even made available to him by somebody there at the State Department because they had a copy before Jim even read it. But one can see James Bamford reading that. Of course, he had the Body of Secrets book that had a chapter on the USS Liberty, which was excellent. But if you go to the website Institute for Research on Middle East Policy, .org, again, that's IRMEP.org, and scroll down to the bottom, you'll see where it says the Arab-Israeli War, USS Liberty. You can actually click on that link and watch the video from C-SPAN of Mr. Bamford reading that declaration that I was able to get to him before the event. And also, you can see the State Department historian I was just talking about, Mark Susser, cutting off the Liberty survivor during the Q&A. I mean, it's just incredible how,
that was
the Israel Firsters have taken over the State Department as well.
Very good. Jim, thanks for the call.
Well, Jim is a very astute person, and when I was invited to speak to an intelligence group here in San Diego, I advised him, and he came down and made a copy. But when the intelligence, they were all retired intelligence guys, and the president was a former station keeper at CIA from San Diego to Mexico City. They're very dignified and qualified. Normally, I won't speak to a group because I don't want to put myself in a position somebody asks a dumb question and I give them a dumb answer or else they take it out of context.
Captain Boston.
But I did speak to that intelligence group.
Yes.
And Jim came down and made a video of it. And it was a good day. I was supposed to talk for half an hour. I think I talked for an hour, and then I had a half an hour question. So they were all interested. And it's a funny thing when you start telling your story, my story. Obviously I don't use notes. I just go ahead and talk as I'm doing right now.
Captain Boston, we have other callers on the phone.
All right, go ahead.
Can you stay with us like after the hour?
Can I what?
Can you stay with us till to the next hour, for the next hour?
Well, I can try.
Okay. Okay. Well, we have a caller from Canada. Go ahead, Ramsey.
Yes, hello, sir. I just want to make a comment and a question. Secretary of State at the time, Dean Rusk, said the attack on the USS Liberty was deliberate. So the government knew that this wasn't an accident.
Well, I can't hear him very well.
Did the government suppress the investigation because the Jews in Israel told them to do it, or was it the Jews in the United States who told them to do it?
Okay. Did you hear the question, Captain?
No, I didn't hear the question. Tell me what he said.
Okay. He said that at that time, Ramsey, who was Dean Rusk?
Dean Rusk, Secretary of State at the time.
Yeah, Secretary of State at the time, Dean Rusk, he did say that it was deliberate action by the Israelis, but his question was, who put the pressure on the United States government? Was it the pro-Israel Jewish community in the United States, or was it Israel itself?
It was indirect, I would say, because Johnson. Now, here again, I didn't learn any of this about Johnson's behavior in the White House, incident of this. I wasn't privy to what was going on. Admiral Geis was the carrier group commander, and got blasted with a loud blast for both Johnson and McNamara. They recall the planes, and one of my friends here in the local area was the skipper of a squadron that was airborne, ready to go and get the rascals, and they got recalled. Well, a lot of that didn't come out. Now, Admiral Geis allegedly, and I think Lieutenant Painter is the one he told us to. You can check this out. I believe it was Painter, and I learned this
now.
Just way
tell
after
me?
that. Painter said that Geis said, "What?"
Sir, I have one more question.
What's that?
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. He has another question. Go ahead.
Yes, my question is, what was how did the media cover all this when it happened?
How did the media cover all this at the time, Captain Boston?
Well, that was another area that we had to be circumspect. We were accused of telling, of distorting the sailors and the people who were able to testify before our court. So many by innuendo that was rigged. It wasn't rigged in my watch. I didn't have anything to do with being rigged, if it were. But the newspaper people were there waiting for us in Malta, and they had a big canvas thing around the dry dock. So the Russians were up on the hill over the dry dock, they said, trying to get pictures. It didn't make a lot of sense. But anyway, the Russian trawler and American trawler followed us back from the Egyptian waters to Malta. And I think one body came out through that hole, but a lot of classified matter would come out through the hole. And the Russians were grabbing what they could grab, and we were trying to grab what we had. But the newspaper people were there. Oh boy, they were having a feast when we got there. But I had to admonish each witness after they testified that this is a highly classified court of inquiry, and you will not talk to anybody until after the people in Washington release the information that is releasable, or in other words, declassified.
Okay.
So there's an awful lot of stuff that went in that court that probably still, as far as communications matter. So anyway, the newspaper people would get these kids over on the beach and get them in a bar, and we try to get them drunk to talk, and then we'd have to say, "Hey, can't talk now." And because you can't talk until the court inquiry is finished, number one. And number two, it's just like any trial or any investigation, FBI or what have you, while you're investigating something, you don't go out in the street and say what it's all about. But the newspaper people were pretty busy. Now, there was one other thing that came up. I'll throw this out for what it's worth. We were in the second day, or maybe, I don't know, the afternoon of the first day in Malta, and a blue ribbon, I think it was one Air Force, I don't know whether it's a 2-star, a Navy 2-star, and I believe an Army, maybe a 3. They were all JCS people, and they flew in, came aboard, and they thought maybe they should take over the court of inquiry, take over the investigation, they'd be called, not a court. And Admiral Kidd asked me, he said, what? I said, no. I said, we've been convened by the appropriate authority, and the SAR said, finished, we started it. Well, they weren't too happy, but they left, and didn't stay around. But the newspaper people, boy, they were on top of everything, and they were trying to get anything they could get.
Okay,
but,
do you know anything about...
I thought,
Captain Boston?
Go ahead.
Yeah, do you know anything about the... at first, when the news came out that the Liberty was hit, the news came out saying that it was the Egyptians who were involved, in the attack. And actually, 2 planes left one of the carriers group there in the Mediterranean, headed towards Cairo. Do you know anything about that story?
Well, that was... I didn't know then, but now, well, I didn't even know then. We had a couple of ECs that had tapes. NSA apparently got the tapes, and I don't think I know that they didn't release those tapes, although Crystal claims he got the tapes released. What he put out after that declaration was not self-serving, put it that way. But these 2 ECs were flying and taking in an awful lot of information, which I think should still come out for the record purposes if the NSA would ever let it go. But I was told, I talked to a 3-star admiral today, named David Richardson, and he was a 6th Fleet commander after Admiral Martin had. Admiral Martin was the 6th Fleet commander when this matter happened, and then Dave Richardson succeeded him well after the Liberty, a year or so after Liberty. And he's a wonderful person to talk with. And I've had him with me when I've been interviewed. But he knew about a highly secret receiver they had in Crete that picked up an awful lot. It still hasn't come out, and at least we haven't had any reason to be told about it. So it's just the same old story. When they start covering up, they keep going, and if this wasn't a classic example. But I didn't answer the question when somebody asked earlier about the who orchestrated it in Washington. Well, Kid said that there were a couple. I sort of, in a way, describe them as GS-88s, because my 3 tours that I had in Washington, you deal with people who don't know very much about the subject, but get appointed to positions, and you can see that coming out right now by a lot of these political appointees who cause more headaches than it's worth. But normally, some of those people are mean, and some are good-natured. But who orchestrated it back there? With Ike, but he said a couple of, and he didn't know. I don't remember. I can't remember whether he said they were State Department or Johnson's people.
Captain Boston.
Yeah.
Okay. I want you to stay with me. We're going to be. We have like about half a minute left in the first hour. When we come back, we're going to have Mark Glenn joining us, and we will go on. I promise I won't keep you for the whole hour, and I'll keep you for like 20 or 30 minutes. A couple of questions from Mark Glenn, and then we will move on. I think, I appreciate you coming on tonight, and if you would just stay with me for, we're going to be gone for about 3 minutes, and then we'll come back with the second hour.
Well, I apologize for half of my hearing isn't exactly the greatest, but some of the questions I didn't quite come through too clearly, but I know it's communications there again.
This Week in